Judge insults Michelle Obama. In court, minutes later, she gets him arrested. The courtroom was heavy with the kind of silence that throbbed under the skin. Too perfect, too precise. As Michelle Obama stepped through the double oak doors, the echo of her heels on the marble floor cracked the tension like a whip. Heads turned. Not out of respect, but curiosity laced with skepticism. Rows of cold, polished benches held faces both familiar and hostile. In the jury box, a middle-aged white man crossed his arms and leaned back with a smirk. Two women beside him whispered behind tightly pressed lips. Michelle could feel their gaze slicing through her like knives searching for a weakness. The reporters weren't much better. Pens poised, eyes gleaming, waiting for a stumble to turn into a headline. Behind the plaintiff's table, her assistant shifted nervously, but Michelle remained composed. Her chin lifted slightly. Her stride didn't falter, because she knew. Today wasn't just about evidence. It was about resistance. Howard Gates sat high above them all, cloaked in the black robe of authority, yet his posture reeked of arrogance, not justice. He didn't rise or acknowledge her presence as a professional. Instead, he leafed slowly through a file with deliberate indifference, his fingers dragging across each page like it bored him to even hold it. When Michelle approached the center, he didn't look up. "Ah," he drawled finally, voice soaked in disdain. "Miss Obama, back again. Let's hope today you brought something more useful than a stack of papers and another lecture on morality." The words landed like a slap across the room. Gasps were swallowed. A couple of jurors shifted. The defense attorney, a white man in a navy suit with a smug gleam in his eyes, snorted softly under his breath. Michelle didn't blink, but deep in her chest she felt that familiar burn. Rage, not at the insult itself, but at how expected it was, how systematic. She drew in a quiet breath and took her place at the plaintiff's table. Calm, controlled, but her knuckles whitened as she smoothed a document. The courtroom was small, but the power imbalance was enormous. She wasn't just fighting a legal battle. She was challenging a structure built to silence voices like hers. Gates finally looked at her, his eyes calculating, amused. "Ms. Obama, I hope we won't need to waste the court's time today with impassioned speeches and redundant evidence," he said. The emphasis on waste hung in the air like a noose. Michelle let the insult linger. She glanced once at the jury. One or two avoided her gaze. Others looked unimpressed. This wasn't just disrespect. It was sabotage cloaked in protocol, and he knew exactly what he was doing. "I assure the court," Michelle replied evenly, "what I bring today is neither redundant nor impassioned. It is fact, and it is necessary." Gates leaned back in his chair, a slight curl in his lip. "We'll see," he muttered. "Proceed, if you must." The defense table chuckled again. Michelle kept her voice steady, but her pulse surged. Every movement, every sentence had to walk a razor-thin line. Too aggressive and she'd be labeled angry. Too reserved and they'd call her weak. That was the unspoken war. Michelle's fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon as she laid out the first set of documents under the projection screen. Rows of financial spreadsheets flickered onto the wall, black and white, cold and clinical. But underneath them burned the smoking pulse of corruption. "These records," she began, her voice steady but charged, "are direct disbursement logs from the City Redevelopment Fund, supposedly used for infrastructure improvement in District 12. She paused, letting the silence settle for half a second before striking again. "They indicate multiple wire transfers, some exceeding $700,000 each, funneled through shell corporations that did not exist 6 months prior to approval." Her pointer tapped a red flag column. "And those funds," she added, "were authorized without oversight, bypassing every required audit checkpoint." The courtroom leaned forward, but just as quickly, a voice sliced through the air. "Objection," Judge Gates said, without even glancing at the documents. "This evidence is irrelevant unless you can show intent." Michelle blinked once, resisting the urge to clench her jaw. "Your Honor," she said slowly, "the disbursement logs are not only relevant, they are foundational. They show numbers, Miss Obama," Gates interrupted, tone mocking. "Not proof, not criminality, just numbers in your Interpretation. A rustle moved through the defense table like a ripple of victory. The smug defense attorney smirked, adjusting his tie, while a juror in the front row narrowed his eyes, confused but silent. Michelle swallowed the rising frustration and placed a second folder on the projector. Then allow me to continue, she said, because these aren't just numbers. They are patterns, and patterns reveal intent. She clicked to the next page, revealing another chart with overlaid transactions. These four companies received identical payment amounts within minutes of each other, all traced to one IP address used to access the city finance portal. She paused. That IP address was registered to the defendant's home office. Before the weight of her words could even fully register, Gates slammed his gavel down. Enough, Miss Obama, he snapped. You are presenting theory, not fact. The court is not a place for conspiracy narratives. Her stomach tightened, a cold knot of fury forming. Your Honor, I'm not speculating. I'm citing digital forensics. She pushed back, her voice slightly rising. These transfers are traceable. They're verified by third-party audits. Still inadmissible, Gates barked. You failed to establish a proper chain of custody for this data. Michelle stared at him, stunned for the briefest moment. Not because she didn't expect resistance, but because he wasn't even pretending to hide his bias now. He wasn't judging the evidence. He was burying it, deliberately, systematically. The projector's light flickered across her face, casting her eyes in sharp shadows as she slowly turned off the device. Around her, the courtroom had shifted from passive to uneasy. Some jurors exchanged glances. A reporter near the back scribbled furiously, sensing that something wasn't right. Michelle took a breath, lowered her hands to the table, and steadied herself. Are you telling me, she said, voice quieter but cutting, that verified financial data, subpoenaed legally and cross-checked by two independent firms, is not permitted in this courtroom? Gates leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. I'm telling you that your foundation is cracked, counselor, he said with venom, and I won't allow this trial to turn into a circus on your behalf. Silence stretched long and taut like piano wire. Michelle's pulse thundered behind her eyes, but her hands didn't tremble. She knew what he was doing. He was making her the spectacle, not the crime. He wanted the jury to focus on her tone, her posture, her persistence, as if her presence was more offensive than the theft of millions in taxpayer dollars. She saw it in the smirks around her, in the leaning postures of the defense table. They didn't fear her argument. They feared her proving them wrong, and that the system would let her do it. But Michelle wasn't done, not even close. She slid another document forward, slowly, deliberately. This, she said, is a signed email from the defendant, approving the exact amounts in question. Gates didn't even glance at it. Stricken from the record, he said coldly. You're wasting our time. And just like that, another truth was erased, not by evidence, but by authority. Michelle stood in that courtroom not as a lawyer, but as a woman fighting a machine that refused to see her as equal. The walls weren't white. They were gray and complicit, and every denial, every shutdown was a nail in the coffin of justice. But she didn't flinch, didn't bow. Instead, she stared back at Howard Gates and thought, you can silence my voice today, but you just handed me the proof I need to tear your kingdom down tomorrow. Michelle flipped to the next page of the file, her hands steady but her heart pounding like a war drum beneath her ribs. The numbers were damning enough: bloated project costs, inflated invoices, shell corporations stacked like Russian dolls. But it was the signature at the bottom that made the air in the courtroom turn to ice. There it was, in smooth, unmistakable ink. Howard L. Gates, bold, confident, official. For a moment, she thought her eyes had deceived her, that perhaps it was a coincidence, a different Gates, a forged name, anything but this. But no. She double-checked the city registrar stamp, the approval code, the date, everything aligned with the documents entered into the city's budget system under the authority of the judiciary. Her breath caught in her throat, not out of shock, but because she understood the weight of what she was holding. This wasn't just corruption. This was conspiracy. And the man behind the bench wasn't just covering for the accused. He was part of the machinery that made the theft possible. She placed the document into her folder without a word, careful not to draw attention yet. The courtroom was on a short recess, and most of the gallery had cleared out, but Gates remained seated at his bench, scribbling something onto a legal pad with a faint scowl. Michelle walked slowly past him on her way out, not to provoke, not to signal intent, but because the path led directly by the dais, and just as she passed, his voice slid out like a serpent in the dark. "Some things," he said without looking up, "are better left buried." Michelle stopped mid-step, the hairs on her neck rising. She turned her head slightly, catching his gaze as he lifted it deliberately toward her. His eyes weren't furious. They were calm, cold, practiced. "Especially," he added, "if you still want to practice law after this trial." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed heavy and personal, like a glove slapped across the face in a prelude to war. Michelle didn't flinch. She stood still, absorbing the threat, not just to her case, but to her career, her reputation, maybe even her safety. "Is that a warning, Your Honor?" she asked quietly, her tone stripped of fear, edged with steel. Gates smiled, but it was a dead thing, lips curving without warmth, without humanity. "It's advice," he replied. "Take it how you will." Michelle looked him straight in the eye, and for a heartbeat neither of them moved. The courtroom may have been quiet, but the walls seemed to press in, listening, bearing witness to something far more dangerous than a judicial dispute. This wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about power. When she walked out of the courtroom, her pace was slow but deliberate, every footstep echoing with purpose. She didn't say a word to her assistant, who waited anxiously outside the chamber doors. Her mind was a battlefield. Plans, options, consequences exploding like landmines across her thoughts. She had seen corruption before. She had exposed fraud, confronted CEOs, dismantled financial empires brick by brick. But this was different. This was a man who had the power to dismiss evidence with a wave of his hand, bury truths beneath the gavel, and now he was threatening her in the open because he believed he was untouchable. Because for so long he had been. And Michelle realized in that moment that she was alone. She reached a quiet corridor and leaned briefly against the wall, breathing deep. Her fingers clutched the folder tight, the edges pressing into her palm like a physical reminder of what was at stake. She thought of every woman, every person of color who had walked into a courtroom believing in justice, only to be silenced by men like Howard Gates. And she made a decision. She would not be silent. Not now. Not ever. If Gates thought intimidation would work, he had chosen the wrong enemy. Michelle opened her phone and sent a message. One word, one name, to a federal contact she had trusted for years. Then she turned and walked back toward the courtroom, her eyes lit not by fury, but by precision, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that dismantles. Back in the courtroom, Gates returned moments later, wearing the same arrogant mask he always wore. He didn't glance at her. He didn't need to. His message had been sent, his dominance asserted. Michelle remained still as the room filled again, feeling the weight of his presence pressing against her like a smog. But something had changed, not in him. In her, he had shown his hand, and now she knew exactly how to beat him, not by shouting, not by pleading, but by showing everyone in that room that the emperor wore robes soaked in rot. Michelle moved with the kind of deliberate calm that made people hold their breath. She reached into her case and pulled out a single folder, its edges sharp and clean, the paper inside still warm from the photocopier. The courtroom, packed to the seams, seemed to pause in anticipation. Even the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead felt muted. She stepped toward the projection screen and, with the quiet certainty of someone who had checked every line, every code, every legal ground, she laid the page down beneath the display. Numbers appeared first, columns, line items, totals. Then the signatures. And there it was, glowing across the wall behind her. Howard L. Gates in bold black ink, directly beneath a misappropriated $3.8 million budget approval for a non-existent infrastructure firm. The silence snapped like glass. Then a low collective intake of breath echoed from the gallery. Michelle turned to face the room, her voice cutting clean through the tension. This approval form, she said, was signed not by a project manager, not by a financial auditor, but by the presiding judge of this courtroom. Gates reacted like she'd fired a shot across the bench. He jolted forward, slamming his gavel once, hard, the sharp crack like a whip against the room's skin. "That's enough," he barked, his voice jagged with fury. "That document is a fabrication. It has no place in these proceedings." Michelle stood her ground, eyes locked on his. "The document," she said, calmly but firmly, "was obtained through a subpoena signed by the Office of Inspector General. It has been verified by 2 forensic analysts, and its digital signature matches the original database." Gates rose slightly in his chair, his robes swaying as he leaned over the bench, eyes narrowing. "I don't care how many analysts you've paraded behind this circus," he spat. "This is slander. That document is inadmissible." The gavel came down again, his knuckles whitening as he gripped it. "Stricken from the record." The jurors flinched. Some looked away. Others looked at Michelle like they were seeing her for the first time. Not just a lawyer, but a threat to the very foundations they'd been told to trust. A reporter in the front row scribbled so fast his pen snapped against the pad. The defense attorney whispered something to his client, who had gone pale, his confidence evaporating with every second the screen remained lit. Michelle didn't move, didn't blink. "Your Honor," she said, her voice low but razor sharp, "you don't get to strike a truth simply because it threatens your seat." Gates's face darkened. His nostrils flared. "Are you accusing this bench of criminal misconduct?" "I'm not accusing," she replied, her tone unwavering. "I'm presenting evidence. It's the bench that now must answer to it." The atmosphere turned electric. Every eye locked on the judge. No one moved, no one spoke. Michelle's words hovered in the air like live wires, sparking off every wall, every stare. Gates's hand hovered over his gavel again, but he didn't bring it down. His authority, so long unchallenged, so long wielded like a weapon, was now trembling under the weight of a single piece of paper. His voice dropped, barely a growl. "This ends now, Ms. Obama. If you continue down this path, you'll face consequences far beyond this courtroom." But his threat sounded hollow, desperate, because everyone could see the truth burning behind Michelle's eyes, and worse, for him, they could see the fear creeping into his. She stepped away from the projector and let the signature stay there, big and bold, for all to witness. The truth was no longer confined to file folders and back rooms. It was up on the wall, undeniable, unshakable, and it had the judge's name on it. The courtroom had fallen into a tense silence, like the kind that comes before a lightning strike. Michelle Obama stood poised at the plaintiff's table, her expression unreadable, but her eyes locked on Judge Howard Gates with a gaze that burned straight through marble. For a moment, no one moved. The last document had already shaken the room, but she wasn't done, not by a long shot. Calmly, she reached into her briefcase and retrieved a small silver device, compact and cold, like the truth it carried. She didn't say anything right away. She let the object speak for itself as she placed it squarely on the center of the table. Her hand hovered over the button, and when she pressed play, the voice that filled the courtroom was unmistakable, gravelly, authoritative, and drenched in venom. "Make sure she never gets her hands on the ledgers. I don't care how. Just take care of it." The room froze. Michelle didn't speak. She didn't need to. The words had detonated like a bomb in the middle of the room, and the fallout had already begun. Every head turned toward the bench. Gates had gone pale, his usual smug expression vanishing like smoke. His fingers, once casually drumming the gavel, now gripped the edge of his bench like it might anchor him in place. A reporter in the front row dropped his notepad, the slap of it hitting the floor barely audible over the stunned silence. Another journalist fumbled for his phone, already recording, eyes wide in disbelief. Gasps rippled through the gallery as if the very walls had inhaled sharply. One juror, an elderly woman in a brown cardigan, visibly recoiled. The court stenographer, trained to remain neutral, paused for the first time since the trial began, her fingers suspended over the keyboard like time itself had stopped. Gates didn't move. He couldn't. His voice, immortalized in that single damning sentence, echoed through the courtroom like a ghost demanding justice. Michelle let the recording play out in full. It was short, just under 20 seconds, but those seconds felt eternal. In them was the unfiltered, undeniable truth. A judge, this judge, conspiring to obstruct justice, silencing the law he was sworn to uphold. She stepped forward slightly, her voice quiet but slicing clean through the tension. "That voice," she said, "belongs to Judge Howard Gates." The recording was obtained legally as part of a wider investigation into judicial misconduct and collusion with the defendant. Gates opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. His throat convulsed, his eyes darting to the corners of the room, as if searching for an escape, a rebuttal, anything to counter what had just been played. But there was nothing, no denial, no spin, just the sound of his own corruption laid bare before everyone. The defense attorney jumped to his feet, desperate to salvage what little ground they had left. "Objection! That recording could be fabricated. There's no proof it hasn't been tampered with," he shouted. Michelle didn't even look at him. "The digital signature has already been verified by a third-party forensic lab. The chain of custody is clean. I have the report ready for submission," she said flatly, eyes still locked on Gates. She wasn't wasting time. She wasn't arguing. She was presenting a death sentence for a legacy built on lies. Gates slammed the gavel once, twice. Wild, unfocused motions, his voice cracking as he barked, "Silence! This courtroom is out of order." But the gavel had lost its power. No one listened, because now everyone could see what he really was. Not a judge, but a man desperately clinging to a throne built on sand. The jury looked stunned, shifting in their seats like they'd just witnessed something criminal in real time. Because they had. Cameras from local media, previously silent observers, now buzzed with renewed energy. The trial was no longer just about a crooked developer. It was about the man presiding over the entire proceeding. Michelle didn't press forward. She stood still and let the evidence breathe. The truth, once spoken, didn't need to be shouted. It had its own weight. Her heart thudded in her chest, but her expression remained composed. She had waited for this moment, fought for it, bled for it, and now it was here, unfolding not with grand explosions, but with the cold certainty of justice finally catching up to the powerful. Judge Gates finally found his voice, but it was hollow, strained. "You've crossed a line, Miss Obama," he whispered, though the microphone betrayed his tremor. "You don't know what you're doing." Michelle leaned in just slightly, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. "On the contrary, Your Honor," she replied, "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm holding the law accountable, even if it's sitting on the bench." Another gasp erupted from the back row. Even the bailiff shifted, unsure whether to intervene or simply bear witness. Michelle turned and retrieved a sealed envelope from her case, holding it up. "This contains the transcript of the recording, signed and certified by the DOJ's Oversight Division. I move to submit it into evidence and request immediate review of the judge's conduct." There was nowhere left to run. Gates looked down at his desk, then back at Michelle, his mouth twitching but no words coming. The gavel sat motionless. The room had turned against him, not with hatred, but with clarity. The illusion had shattered. Michelle stood in the center of it all, not victorious, not smug, but resolute. This wasn't about winning a trial. It was about dismantling a wall that had stood for too long, one brick at a time. And with that one sentence, make sure she never gets her hands on the ledgers. She had taken down its foundation. A slow murmur began building in the room, reporters whispering into phones, jurors exchanging glances. The bailiff stepped forward, awaiting orders that would never come. And Michelle, she just stood there, unshaken, because truth, once exposed, does not retreat. It doesn't apologize. It demands reckoning. And that reckoning had just begun. Michelle didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her eyes locked onto the uniformed officer standing by the rear door. A subtle nod, small and deliberate, but loaded with consequence. The response was immediate. The door swung open, and two federal agents in black suits and stern expressions stepped into the courtroom like thunder rolling in after a flash of lightning. Their presence was sharp, electric, as though the very air recognized the authority they carried. Gas fluttered through the gallery like a flock of startled birds. All eyes snapped toward the agents, and then, inevitably, toward the man still seated behind the bench. Judge Howard Gates froze, his fingers hovering above the gavel as if it might still save him. But justice was no longer something he could pound into submission. It was walking toward him, measured, precise, unrelenting. Judge Howard Gates, one agent announced, his voice ringing with unshakable certainty. You are hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial authority, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The silence that followed was monumental, so deep, so complete, it pressed into every corner of the room like a suffocating fog. Gates blinked once, then twice, his jaw working furiously to summon words that wouldn't come. His eyes darted to the jury box, to the reporters, to the defense attorney. Anyone who might object, intervene, save him. No one moved, no one spoke, because no one could deny what they had just witnessed. His voice, the recording, his signature on the stolen millions. The evidence was no longer buried in files or hidden in courtrooms. It had been dragged into the light, and that light now scorched him. Gates shot up from his chair, his robe flaring like a dying flame. This is outrageous, he barked, spittle flying. I am the law in this courtroom. The words came out, half roar, half plea. I am the law. But they rang hollow, desperate echoes from a man watching his own empire collapse beneath him. The agents didn't flinch. They stepped forward with clinical calm, one pulling a set of handcuffs from his belt, the other placing a firm hand on Gates's arm. Sir, place your hands behind your back, the agent instructed. Gates resisted for a moment, eyes wild. You have no jurisdiction here. This is my courtroom, he shouted, his voice cracking on the final word. Michelle remained rooted in place, her face carved from granite. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was speaking louder than any gavel ever could. The sound of the metal cuffs snapping shut was like a final verdict, echoed by the stunned gasps that filled the room. A symphony of justice, slow, deliberate, unforgiving. Gates stood there, now cuffed, his arms drawn behind him, shoulders heaving with furious, shallow breaths. The same hands that had waved away evidence, silenced objections, and sentenced men and women with impunity were now locked behind his back. He looked around one last time, his gaze sweeping the room like a drowning man, searching for a lifeline. But the jurors stared down at their laps. The reporters pointed cameras. And Michelle, she stood tall, her expression calm, her silence louder than his screams. The courtroom, once his domain, had turned against him. The bench no longer felt like a throne. It felt like a prison he'd built with his own arrogance. One of the agents gave him a final warning. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Gates let out a bitter, breathless laugh. This is a witch hunt, he snarled. A political stunt. But no one was listening, because the man who claimed to embody the law had just been unmasked as its betrayer. The camera shutters clicked like Judgment Day ticking forward, capturing the fall of a man who thought himself untouchable. As the agents began to escort him toward the exit, Gates stumbled once, nearly falling. The courtroom didn't react. No gasps, no sympathy. The silence returned, heavier than ever. Michelle watched him go, her posture unyielding, her hands still resting on the plaintiff's table. This wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge. It was something deeper, righteous, cold, necessary. She had faced the system and exposed its rot, and now that rot was being dragged out in chains. The walls of the courtroom seemed different now, less ominous, less sacred, because the myth of invincibility had been broken in front of everyone. Gates twisted one last time toward the gallery. You'll regret this, he hissed. All of you. You're tearing down the justice system. But no one responded, because the system he spoke of, the one that protected him, enabled him, was never justice to begin with. It was a mask, a costume draped over a man drunk on power. Michelle's eyes never left him as he vanished through the door, and when it clicked shut behind him, a subtle shift rippled through the room. A release. A breath that no one had realized they'd been holding finally exhaled. The monster in robes had been caged, and the courtroom, for the first time in years, felt honest. The courtroom was still reverberating from the shock of seeing Judge Howard Gates escorted out in handcuffs, but the ripples hadn't stopped there. They were just beginning to spread, like cracks in glass, quiet but deadly. In the far corner behind the defendant's table, several faces had lost their color. These weren't just lawyers or executives. These were men who had shared quiet dinners with Gates, who'd made late-night calls and traded handshakes that never left a paper trail. Their confidence was unraveling by the second, each one mentally retracing their steps, wondering which emails they forgot to delete, which documents they failed to shred. A city council aide shifted nervously in his seat. A senior city auditor at the back slipped out of the room under the pretense of taking a call, though everyone knew why. The walls had ears now, and every eye was watching. No one wanted to be the next name in Michelle Obama's evidence file. The defendant's lead attorney, Richard Mallory, stood slowly, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. The smugness he'd worn like armor for the entire trial had evaporated, leaving behind only a veneer of civility masking desperation. He stepped around the defense table, approaching Michelle with the kind of measured politeness a man uses when he knows the tide has turned. "Ms. Obama," he said, lowering his voice just enough to seem cooperative. "Perhaps we can speak. Off the record." Michelle didn't flinch. She didn't look up from the file she was closing with quiet finality. "Everything is on the record now, Mr. Mallory," she said, her voice ablade beneath velvet. "That's the point, isn't it?" He hesitated, his polished demeanor cracking slightly before forcing a smile. "There's no need to escalate this into something messy," he offered. "Surely we can find a resolution that benefits all parties." Michelle finally looked at him then, and her eyes were ice. "Your client funneled millions of taxpayer dollars through a network of shell companies, all under the protection of a judge who just got let out in handcuffs," she said sharply. "You don't get to define messy anymore." The room was still listening. Every juror, every reporter, every legal aide held their breath as if watching a high-stakes standoff. Mallory's jaw tightened. He tried to pivot. "Then maybe we can consider some sort of plea arrangement," he suggested carefully. "A reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation." Michelle didn't blink. "That window closed the moment you smirked while my evidence was being dismissed," she replied. "You gambled on arrogance. Now you get to sit with the consequences." Mallory's smile died. He stepped back, no longer the confident attorney, but a man watching the ground crumble beneath him. Behind him, his client, billionaire developer Charles Reardon, sat frozen, sweat collecting along his hairline, fingers tapping a rapid beat against the polished mahogany table. The empire he had built on favoritism, backdoor deals, and judicial immunity was crumbling in real time, and he had no one left to shield him. He leaned forward slightly, whispering to Mallory, but the lawyer raised a hand as if to say, "It's too late." Michelle turned away from them both, collecting her files with quiet efficiency. The moment had passed. She wasn't here to bargain. She was here to finish what she started. In the back row, one of Gates's former clerks sat rigid, beads of sweat trailing down the side of his face. He knew what was coming. The subpoenas, the investigations, the whispered phone calls from federal agencies asking about conversations he'd long hoped were forgotten. The gallery was no longer an audience. It was a lineup of potential co-conspirators, each one wondering if their name was next on the board. Michelle's footsteps echoed as she walked toward the exit, every eye following her. But she didn't bask in it. There was no victory lap, just the heavy, unshakable sense that justice had only just begun digging into the rot. She paused at the doors, her hand on the frame, then turned her head slightly, her voice slicing through the charged silence. "Anyone else who shared a table with Gates," she said loud enough for all to hear, "might want to start speaking to someone in federal law enforcement before I speak for them." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, a declaration, a warning shot that justice didn't stop at the robe. It would reach into every office, every closed-door meeting, every signature stamped in the dark. Michelle stepped out, leaving behind a courtroom that had transformed into a battlefield. And for the first time in years, the people who thought they owned the system were the ones scrambling for cover. The footage hit the internet like a lightning strike. In under 2 hours, the video of Judge Howard Gates being escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs exploded across social media platforms. No filters, no spin, just raw, unedited justice caught in 1080p. The once untouchable man, robes still swaying, wrists bound in steel, shouting, "I am the law," as two federal agents dragged him through the stunned silence of his own courtroom. The clip was only 37 seconds long, but it carried the weight of decades of injustice. Within minutes, Twitter was ablaze. TikTok edits popped up with dramatic music overlays. Instagram Reels played his fall in slow motion, captioned with words like "poetic justice" and "this is what accountability looks like." By morning, Justice for All and Michelle Obama were trending nationwide. But behind the hashtags wasn't just celebration. There was something more dangerous. Hope. Hope that the system wasn't unbreakable, that someone, anyone, could stare down power and make it answer. But hope had a twin. Rage. Rage that it had taken this long. Rage that it took a woman like Michelle, a black woman, scrutinized, dismissed, underestimated at every turn, to drag a corrupted man from his pedestal when so many had looked the other way. Comment sections ignited with stories. Victims of Gates's courtroom, who had once been silenced, now finding their voices amplified. A mother wrote, "He took my son's future with a smirk. Now he's the one begging." A public defender posted, "I tried to speak out. I was told to watch my tone." Thank you, Michelle. It wasn't just viral. It was seismic. It was cultural. This wasn't a scandal. It was a reckoning. News outlets scrambled to catch up with the internet's roar. CNN broke into regular programming with a developing story banner, showing Michelle's stoic face beside a grainy mugshot of Gates, his expression dazed, defiant, undone. MSNBC replayed the courtroom clip on loop. Conservative networks attempted to downplay the charges, calling them politically motivated. But the damage was done. Truth was trending. And with every retweet, with every stitch and share, the myth of invincibility that had cloaked men like Gates began to rot in the daylight. The people were watching now. And they weren't looking away. Michelle didn't issue a statement right away. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any press conference. While others clamored for commentary, she remained focused, returning to work like it was just another case file to close. But the world had already decided she was a symbol, not of perfection, but of defiance, of resilience forged in fire. Old clips of her being interrupted, belittled, ignored in earlier courtrooms resurfaced and were stitched into the narrative. "They laughed at her," one tweet read. "Now she's rewriting the rules." Support came flooding in from all corners. Lawyers, activists, everyday people who had never trusted the system until they saw someone fight it from the inside. But amid the viral storm, Michelle knew better than to celebrate. She knew what power did when cornered. She had exposed one man, yes, but Gates was not alone. He was a node in a much larger web, one that would now fight tooth and nail to survive. There would be backlash, retaliation, whispered campaigns to discredit her, question her motives, smear her name. But Michelle had faced worse. She had been silenced in rooms where she was the most qualified person present. She had been called too assertive, too emotional, too much. And still she stood. That was the real story. Not just that she had won, but that she had refused to bow. The fall of Judge Howard Gates sent a shockwave through the very foundations of the justice system, but it was what came afterward that truly rattled the institution. Within 24 hours of the video going viral, Michelle Obama's office began receiving emails, then calls, then lines of people outside the courthouse. Former defendants, their families, attorneys who had once been silenced by fear or career threats, now came forward with trembling hands and years of pain buried behind their eyes. Case numbers, court transcripts, names of witnesses who were never allowed to speak, evidence that had been deliberately ignored. It all came pouring out like a dam finally breaking. One woman clutched a manila envelope to her chest as if it held her soul. "He gave my son 30 years for possession. First offense," she whispered. "He was 17. Michelle didn't flinch. She took every file, every voice, every story. because she knew exactly what they were: testimonies in a trial long overdue. And as the flood of appeals surged, the legal machine began to shift. Civil rights lawyers who had long given up on the Gates courtroom returned with renewed purpose. Judges in nearby districts opened emergency sessions. Clerks were ordered to pull old case files, dusty and yellowing, from basement archives. The governor's office issued a statement promising an independent review. But everyone knew the real engine of accountability wasn't bureaucracy. It was Michelle. She had become more than an attorney, more than a whistleblower. She was a force, a name whispered with reverence in courtrooms and classrooms, in churches and street corners, from legal scholars to single mothers who once believed the system was rigged and untouchable. Her defiance had ripped open a gate that no one dared touch before, and now no one could close it again. Michelle didn't ask for the spotlight. She never needed it. But she couldn't walk anywhere without being recognized now, not for fame, but for what she represented. To Black girls in law schools, she was proof that their voice could pierce through centuries of silence. To women of color who had sat on courtroom benches only to be ignored, talked over, belittled, she was validation. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't untouchable, but she was visible. And that visibility was revolution. News stations lined up for interviews. Editorials named her the people's prosecutor. And still she stayed quiet, focused, determined. Her office lights burned late into the night. Her phone rang nonstop. But she didn't slow down. Because this wasn't a moment, it was a movement. She walked into one appeal hearing where the defendant, a man named Jerome Turner, had served 18 years for a crime he didn't commit. When she entered the room, his daughter wept in the corner. "I told him you'd come," she cried. "I told him someone would come." Michelle sat down, opened the file, and began, not with grandstanding, not with spectacle, but with the truth. Laid out, detail by excruciating detail, exposing every manipulation, every judicial shortcut that had stolen nearly 2 decades from an innocent man's life. The judge overseeing the appeal, a younger Latina woman, nodded solemnly, her voice shaking as she ordered the conviction vacated. Michelle didn't celebrate. She just closed the file and reached for the next one. Outside the courthouse, murals began to appear. Graffiti turned into art. Michelle's silhouette painted across concrete walls, eyes fierce, chin lifted. Beneath it, words stenciled in black. She fought for the forgotten. Neighborhoods that once feared courthouses began organizing rides to attend hearings. Young women brought notebooks to sit in the back rows and watch her argue, studying not just her legal acumen, but her presence, her refusal to shrink, her unwavering tone. She became what Gates had always tried to prevent, a mirror held to the system, and the reflection was undeniable, biased, corrupt, in need of burning and rebuilding. But with each overturned case, each name restored, Michelle also carried the weight of what had been lost: time, freedom, families torn apart. Some clients didn't live to see their convictions cleared. Some mothers died waiting. Some fathers passed away in prison cells, their records now posthumously absolved. She felt that weight, carried it in the bags beneath her eyes, the stiffness in her spine, the silence she held on long drives home. But it didn't break her. It sharpened her. Because she had stared down a man who wore power like armor and proved that the truth cuts deeper than the gavel ever could. And now, the world knew it too. Michelle stood quietly at the podium, the lights overhead glaring harshly against her silhouette, capturing every nuance of her expression as cameras flashed relentlessly. The room, packed with reporters, attorneys, activists, and former victims of Judge Gates's courtroom tyranny, was vibrating with tension, anticipation like electricity humming through the air. She took a slow, deliberate breath, gathering the weight of every case, every injustice she'd uncovered into a single, steady moment. Her voice cut the silence with a clarity honed by years of fighting battles she wasn't supposed to win. "Justice," she began slowly, "does not lie in the hand that holds the gavel, but in those who dare stand when the system is rotting from within." Her words struck the audience like a sudden revelation, resonating deeply as pens raced across notepads, capturing every syllable. The cameras clicked in rapid succession, flashes reflecting the fierce resolve in her eyes. She paused, allowing the gravity of her statement to ripple outward. Michelle knew she wasn't just speaking to the people in this room. She was addressing everyone who had ever felt betrayed by the justice system. With unwavering eyes, she leaned slightly forward, her tone growing sharper, more intense. For too long, justice has been a privilege, not a right. It has protected those in power and abandoned the vulnerable. Today, we end that silence. Today, we choose accountability over complicity. Her voice echoed with fierce determination, causing a subtle stir among the crowd. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing the fire behind her carefully chosen words. Michelle lifted her hand briefly, signaling an assistant who stepped forward with a large sign. She unveiled it in front of the podium, bold black letters stark against a pristine white backdrop. Justice Reborn. Murmurs rippled throughout the audience, curiosity sparking in reporters' eyes as they leaned in. Michelle spoke again, firmly. I'm proud to announce the launch of Justice Reborn, a nonprofit organization committed to providing legal support for the voiceless and dismantling systemic corruption in our courts. Excited whispers erupted through the crowd, like the rustling leaves of an approaching storm. Michelle continued, her voice commanding their undivided attention. Justice Reborn isn't just an organization. It's a call to action. It's a promise that no matter how deep the corruption runs, we will shine the harsh light of truth upon it. Her eyes scanned the audience, catching glimpses of hopeful faces that had once seemed defeated. We will stand beside every individual who has faced wrongful conviction, who has seen their rights trampled under biased rulings, who has been silenced by power and privilege. From this day forward, you are not alone. A wave of applause began softly, quickly rising to a powerful crescendo as people stood, clapping and cheering, the room pulsing with the energy of collective purpose. Michelle stood firm, her posture unwavering, absorbing the impact of the moment. As the applause gradually quieted, Michelle leaned into the microphone, her voice softer but piercingly clear. Justice Reborn will dedicate itself to reopening cases mishandled by Judge Gates and others like him, exposing the corruption they thought was untouchable. We will partner with legal experts nationwide, provide pro bono defense teams, and push for legislative reform to prevent abuses of power before they start. She allowed her words to hang in the silence for a heartbeat, letting everyone absorb their weight. Make no mistake, this journey won't be easy. There will be resistance, threats, attempts to silence us, but our resolve is stronger than their corruption. Together, we will build a system founded on truth, integrity, and fairness. That is our promise. That is Justice Reborn. Reporters surged forward, questions flooding the air like a tidal wave. One voice rose above the others, pressing urgently. Ms. Obama, do you fear retaliation? Judge Gates had powerful allies. How do you intend to fight them? Michelle paused only briefly, eyes fierce, jaw set with an unshakable resolve. Retaliation isn't new to me. It's part of the price of fighting injustice, she answered boldly. They tried to silence me before, in courtrooms, behind closed doors, in subtle threats whispered between colleagues. But silence isn't an option anymore. Retaliation only proves how deeply we've cut into the corruption. If they come for me, it means they're afraid. And they should be. Cameras flashed furiously, reporters jotted notes, and supporters in the back cheered loudly, energized by her bravery. Another journalist quickly pressed forward, asking sharply, "What do you say to those who claim your actions are politically motivated?" Michelle turned directly toward the voice, her eyes blazing. Justice doesn't carry a political agenda, she declared passionately. Corruption doesn't discriminate based on party lines. It discriminates based on power. I've spent my career standing in courtrooms, defending the vulnerable against the powerful. I've witnessed firsthand how justice can be twisted by those who hold the keys. So let me be clear. My agenda is truth. My motivation is accountability. If that seems political to some, perhaps it's time they question why honesty and fairness feel like threats. The room fell momentarily silent, her words hitting with profound resonance. Then once again, thunderous applause erupted, filling the air with palpable excitement. Hours later, the echoes of Michelle's speech reverberated across social media, spreading rapidly online. Clips of her powerful declaration flooded timelines, shared widely by activists, legal professionals, and citizens who felt seen, heard, and finally empowered. Twitter erupted in hashtags Justice Reborn trending alongside Michelle Obama, transforming her from a respected attorney into a living symbol of defiance against systemic injustice. People shared personal stories of legal battles lost and won, each post tagging Justice Reborn as a beacon of hope. Within days, Michelle's newly founded organization received thousands of messages from people desperate for help, encouragement, or simply acknowledgement. Law students volunteered to intern, seasoned attorneys offered their services pro bono, and donations poured in from across the nation, enabling rapid expansion. Justice Reborn began forming rapid response legal teams, swiftly reopening controversial cases tied to Judge Gates and similar corrupt figures. Each reopened case sent tremors through courthouses nationwide, proving Michelle's commitment wasn't merely symbolic, it was fiercely actionable. Judges once considered beyond scrutiny were now compelled to answer questions they'd avoided for decades. Evidence previously buried resurfaced. Testimonies long ignored finally echoed clearly in reopened courtrooms. Michelle appeared tirelessly in hearings, calmly dismantling arguments that had been accepted unquestioningly in the past. Each victory strengthened her cause, the public watching captivated as corruption crumbled beneath relentless scrutiny. Yet with each triumph, threats intensified. Anonymous notes appeared on her windshield. Late-night phone calls warned her to back down. Powerful figures, once hidden comfortably in shadowy boardrooms, now felt exposed and cornered. Michelle responded not with fear, but with even greater resolve, publicly documenting intimidation attempts and emphasizing they only proved her work's necessity. Media coverage grew more intense, interviews pouring in from every major network, each highlighting Michelle's unwavering courage and dedication. A generation of aspiring lawyers watched, inspired and emboldened, knowing change was possible when someone dared challenge entrenched power. Justice Reborn quickly evolved beyond merely a legal support organization. It became a movement demanding systemic reform. Across the country, chapters sprang up in law schools, community centers, churches, each advocating for judicial transparency and equality under the law. Michelle personally visited these groups, speaking candidly about her experiences, reinforcing that the fight was far from over. "We have only scratched the surface," so she warned audiences. "The rot runs deeper than any one person or courtroom. We must be vigilant. We must persist. Justice demands it." As momentum built, opponents tried to smear her efforts, accusing Justice Reborn of being divisive, labeling Michelle as an agitator stirring public unrest. Yet each attack only solidified her support base, making it clear that exposing injustice threatened those whose power relied on silence. Michelle stood unflinching, unbowed by criticism, reminding supporters calmly, "When truth becomes controversial, corruption thrives." Our discomfort now means we're finally addressing problems long ignored. Eventually, the tide became unstoppable. Judges across the country now operated knowing their decisions faced intense scrutiny. Prosecutors reconsidered charges carefully, mindful of public accountability. Michelle's steadfast courage and clear vision forged a new judicial reality, one where power feared the people rather than the reverse. Justice Reborn became synonymous not just with legal aid, but with reclaiming faith in a broken system, inspiring everyday citizens to demand fairness loudly and unapologetically. Michelle's initial quiet resolve had ignited a wave, and now that wave roared unstoppably toward lasting change. Yet Michelle herself remained grounded, aware the battle never truly ended. Late nights in her office, surrounded by stacks of case files and photographs of victims she fought for, she knew justice required constant vigilance. There would always be those who abused power, who manipulated truth for personal gain. But now, thanks to Justice Reborn, they knew accountability would always be waiting, relentless and unafraid. Michelle's phone lit up with messages of gratitude from those she'd helped, yet her expression remained focused, determination etched deep in her features. Her fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. The gavel echoed through the courtroom with a sharp, decisive crack, signaling the official end of the trial. Yet Michelle Obama knew, deep in her bones, that the fight had only just begun. She stood motionless for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the silence, a silence pregnant with hope, uncertainty, and the electric current of what had just unfolded. Around her, the gallery stirred, reporters scrambled to file their final stories, and colleagues offered quiet nods of victory. Yet Michelle did not celebrate because she understood that this verdict, though groundbreaking, was just the first domino in a series of battles yet to come. Outside, beyond these oak doors and polished floors, the powerful and corrupt still whispered in dark corners, plotting retaliation and counting on fear to maintain their twisted control. She gathered her papers slowly, deliberately, feeling the eyes of the room tracking her every move. They saw triumph. She saw a war still raging beneath the surface. A war that required vigilance and sacrifice beyond this single moment of courtroom drama. As she stepped toward the exit, Michelle silently acknowledged the bitter truth. The most dangerous part of confronting corruption wasn't in exposing it. It was surviving the fury that followed. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight hit her face sharply, bright and harsh after hours spent beneath artificial lights. Cameras surged forward, microphones thrust toward her, voices shouting questions. She stopped briefly, scanning the crowd of faces, some hopeful, others critical, all waiting for her next move. Michelle's voice rang clear above the chaotic chorus, calm yet unwavering. Justice won today, but this isn't the end. It's merely the beginning. A hush fell over the gathered media, capturing the weight of her words as she continued firmly, eyes intense and direct. Today we uncovered corruption, but tomorrow we must dismantle the system that allowed it to thrive. Complacency is our greatest enemy. She paused briefly, letting her words settle heavily among the reporters, citizens, and supporters who had gathered. If justice is to survive, it demands more than one victory. It demands an unending resolve. Michelle stepped away swiftly, leaving behind a silence punctuated only by the urgent clicks of camera shutters capturing her determined exit. In the quiet sanctuary of her office later that evening, Michelle sat at her desk, reviewing stacks of case files illuminated by the dim glow of her desk lamp. Outside the window, the city buzzed on, unaware of the hidden battles fought nightly in quiet rooms like this. Her phone buzzed constantly, messages pouring in from grateful clients, terrified whistleblowers, and even threats masked behind anonymous numbers. Yet Michelle's expression remained steady, focused, undeterred. She knew that this singular victory had made her an enemy to those who profited from silence, those who thrived on injustice. But instead of fear, Michelle felt only clarity, a renewed sense of purpose stronger than any threat could weaken. Each threat, each whispered promise of harm, merely solidified her determination. She glanced briefly at the photo on her desk, a group portrait of those she'd freed from unjust convictions, faces once shadowed by despair, now illuminated by hope. Michelle knew they depended on her courage just as much as she relied on their resilience, and she would never abandon the fight they had entrusted to her. Days later, the courtroom drama faded from news cycles, replaced by fresh scandals and trivial distractions. Yet Michelle's inbox remained full, a stark reminder that injustice never slept. She carefully read each message, each plea, each desperate call for help, committing their details to memory. She understood now more clearly than ever that the true war for justice was not fought under the bright lights of courtroom theatrics. It was waged in lonely hallways, whispered meetings, and hidden corners where the powerful assumed no one would dare challenge their authority. Michelle rose from her chair and approached the large window overlooking the city. Beneath the glittering lights and towering skyscrapers, countless lives were trapped within systems designed to silence them. She placed a hand against the cool glass, whispering a promise only she could hear. No more silence. Not now, not ever. That promise soon took tangible form as Michelle began assembling her team for Justice Reborn, recruiting lawyers, activists, and investigators who shared her relentless pursuit of truth. Together, they transformed Michelle's quiet promise into a battle cry, organizing tirelessly to reopen buried cases and expose hidden corruption. Yet each move forward was met with vicious resistance. Intimidation attempts escalated, her colleagues received threats, and Justice Reborn offices were vandalized. Still, Michelle stood unwavering, calmly reminding her frightened team, "They attack us because they fear us. Our strength lies in our courage to stand firm despite their attempts to silence us." Her words ignited a renewed determination within her team, emboldening them to push forward harder than before. Soon, their efforts paid off dramatically. Corruption networks once hidden behind polished facades and legal jargon began to unravel under the intense scrutiny of Justice Reborn. Whistleblowers stepped forward, confident their voices would finally be heard. New evidence emerged, turning isolated victories into systemic reform. Michelle watched as corrupt officials resigned or were indicted, as communities regained their trust in a justice system finally proving worthy of its name. But even amidst these victories, she never lost sight of the price paid. She remembered each victim she couldn't save, each family torn apart by unjust convictions. Their memory became the fuel driving her onward, reminding her daily that justice delayed was justice denied, and that complacency was as deadly as complicity. At a public event commemorating their achievements, Michelle took the stage once again, facing an audience filled with faces changed by her work. Her voice rang clear and resolute, echoing with passion born from hard-earned experience. "Justice is not dispensed from high benches," she declared fiercely, eyes scanning the faces before her, "but defended by those willing to walk through hell itself to reclaim the light." Her words resonated deeply, stirring the crowd into thunderous applause. Yet Michelle's expression remained grave, knowing the battle was far from over. "Tonight we celebrate our progress, but tomorrow we return to the fight, because injustice never rests, and neither will we." Later, alone in her office, Michelle reflected quietly on the journey thus far. The initial verdict had been a catalyst, propelling her forward into uncharted, dangerous territory. Yet despite the risks, despite the threats and exhausting battles, Michelle felt no regret, no fear, only a profound sense of purpose. She understood now that true justice was not measured by singular victories, but by continuous courage in the face of relentless adversity. Her phone vibrated gently, displaying a message from a young law student inspired to join her cause, asking simply, "If faced with injustice in a silent courtroom, should I stay quiet or stand up?" Michelle paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing firmly, "Stand. Always." That night, Michelle Obama finally allowed herself a moment of quiet pride, not in personal victory, but in the legacy beginning to unfold around her. Her fight had become a beacon, illuminating a path previously hidden beneath shadows of power and fear. She had proven that corruption could crumble under the weight of unwavering courage, that silence was complicity, and that one voice standing unflinching in the face of injustice could ignite profound, unstoppable change. She switched off the lamp, enveloping her office in darkness, yet the glow from the city outside remained. Michelle knew this was just the first battle, but it was a battle she had won decisively. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new trials. But tonight, in this silent room, she allowed herself a whisper of affirmation. The fight for justice would continue, and she would lead it, steadfastly and without hesitation. If you stood before injustice in a silent courtroom, would you remain silent, or would you stand boldly like Michelle Obama? Justice isn't granted by those sitting high upon benches. It is fiercely protected by those who willingly walk through hell to reclaim the light. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.